My name's Cathy Riddick. I'm the Wales coordinator for Humanists UK. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to have you all in Wales this weekend. It's something that means a lot to us that you've all come here, those of you from Wales and those of you journeying to Wales. Very smug that I had a 20-minute commute to get here, so that was great for me. But we've had a fantastic day sharing humanist values, sharing a lot of what we've done in Wales as well, which has been great. But now I'm delighted to introduce Brian Klaas, who's an expert on democracy and authoritarianism, US politics, Western foreign policy, political violence and elections. He's written many books, including FLUKE, Chance, Chaos and Why Everything Matters, The Despot's Accomplice, and he runs the podcast Power Corrupts. And Brian's going to talk to us today about why everything matters. So over to him. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about this book, which is, it's a perfect audience for this, because what I'm going to be talking you through are some scientific and philosophical ideas I've grappled with that have led me to the conclusion that I have absolutely no cosmic purpose in life, but that my life has more meaning than I ever believed or ever imagined. And I'll explain why I've come to that conclusion, starting with two stories. So the first story begins in Kyoto, Japan in 1926, where a tourist couple goes on vacation, this American tourist couple goes on vacation to Kyoto. Mr. and Mrs. H.L. Stimson. And they sort of explore the city, they fall in love with it, they have a really, really lovely time, and they stay at a place called the Miyako Hotel. And as they're staying there, they get a bit of a soft spot for the place, the way we all do when we go on holiday somewhere. And normally, this doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things, or we can't really tell how it matters in the grand scheme of things. But this vacation really changed history. And that's because 19 years later, Mr. Henry Stimson became America's Secretary of War. And in 1945, he was the chief civilian tasked with the decision of where to drop the first atomic bomb in World War II. And the Target Committee, which was composed of scientists and soldiers, uniformly agreed that Kyoto was the top pick. It had propaganda value as a former imperial capital, it manufactured warplanes. They all agreed, number one choice is Kyoto. Now, Stimson does not want to see this happen, and part of the reason, by the way, another little fluke, is that the bombing plan said that they were going to drop the atomic bomb on the rail yards in the center of Kyoto, which is about 150 meters, still today, from the Miyako Hotel where they stayed in 1926. So Stimson springs to action, and what the generals disparage as his pet city, he tries to save it by twice meeting with President Truman. And eventually Truman relents. He gives in to Stimson, and he changes his mind and takes Kyoto off the targeting list. And so the first atomic bomb ends up getting dropped on Hiroshima instead. The second atomic bomb is slated to go to a place called Kokura. And as the bomber approaches the bomb site, there's this brief bit of unforecasted cloud cover. So the B-29 can't see the actual site of the city. They end up running low on fuel, they go to the secondary target, and the second atomic bomb tragically gets dropped on Nagasaki instead. So you have this aspect where this pivotal moment in both Japanese history, world history in the 20th century and so on, is quite literally pivoting where 200,000 people are living and dying in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as opposed to Kyoto and Kokura, quite literally because of a 19-year-old tourist vacation and a passing cloud. Now this is at odds with some of the ways that we think history often works, or at least the narratives that we tell about history, or the ways in which we say why things happen to us. And the second story that is of this vein, a very different story, starts in 1905 in a little place called Keeler, Wisconsin, a little farmhouse in the Midwest of the United States. And it involves the woman pictured in her wedding photograph, a woman named Clara Maudlin Jansen. And Clara Maudlin Jansen, after she got married, she rapidly had 4 children, back to back to back. And so in 1905, her oldest child is about 4 years old, and she has a mental breakdown. And she tragically decides to take the lives of her 4 young children, and then eventually to take her own life. And you can see the gravestone in Keeler, Wisconsin with the 4 young kids and their very young birth dates for 1905. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is because Clara Maudlin Jansen's husband, the man who came home to find his whole family wiped out, is my great-grandfather. And he was experiencing one of the worst things that people could do, to see his whole family dead. But 10 years later, he remarried, and that woman was my great-grandmother. And so I had no idea about this, sort of like the residents of Kokura unknowing that they were about to be obliterated. I had no idea that my lineage is predicated on the mass murder of young children. Now, when I was in my mid-20s, my dad sat me down and sort of said this to me, and the first reaction, of course, is to say, this is an extremely grisly part of the family history. But the second reaction is to realize that if those children hadn't died, I wouldn't exist. And the bizarre part about this is now I'm looping you into this story too, because if those children hadn't died in 1905, you would not be listening to me right now. And so you have this sort of interconnected nature of the way that things unfold that are completely at odds with these sort of neat and tidy stories we tell each other about why causality operates the way it does, how the world works, and so on, and indeed how social science tries to make sense of this as well. Now, this leads to one of the core ideas of the book, which is that everything is intertwined, an idea that's much more at home in the humanists, I suspect, than in other parts of society, but this idea that there's no action that has zero consequences. And this is tied scientifically to a theory called chaos theory. And I'm going to talk about it. Some of you may have come across this before. It's in popular culture sometimes, but I'll just make sure everyone's on the same page with where it came from. Now, we understand chaos theory often through this saying of the butterfly effect, right? The butterfly flaps its wings, and later on you have a hurricane halfway across the world. Now, the origins of chaos theory are somewhat different, but we internalize the lessons of it, and we accept it as obviously true anytime that we imagine science fiction that involves time travel. And what I mean by that is if you ever watch a film or you read a book where somebody travels, say, 50 years back in time, 1,000,000 years back in time, right before they go back, the warning they're given is always the same in fiction, right? Don't touch anything. Don't talk to the wrong people. Don't step on a bug, because you might change the course of history. You might delete humanity. You might even erase yourself from the story of the universe. Right? So we sort of accept this. It's plausible to us that if you squished the wrong bug 10 million years ago, now humans don't exist. Okay, fair enough. But the question is, why don't we think about that right now? Because cause and effect relationships don't have different patterns depending on whether they were in the past or in the present. They're always the same. So if you squish a bug 10 million years ago and redirect the trajectory of the universe, if you squish a bug today, you might be doing exactly the same thing. You just may never see it, right? So we have this dichotomy of how we think about cause and effect, depending on whether we're thinking about the past or right now. And I think, unfortunately, we downgrade the role of ourselves in writing the future because of this bizarre aspect of thinking this applies to the past but not to the present. Now, the origin story scientifically of chaos theory comes fittingly from a man who was involved with forecasting cloud cover during bombing runs in World War II in the Pacific Theater, who was frustrated by the lack of ability to forecast clouds. And his name was Edward Norton Lorenz. And because he was so frustrated, after the war, he decided to try to develop a new computer model to forecast the weather. And he used this sort of rudimentary computer. He plugged in 12 variables for how forecasting might operate with the weather, and he set the simulations running. And one day he decides, okay, I'm going to rerun that simulation, but it's going to take forever on this old computer to do this, so I'll just start halfway through. This is no problem because he has computer printouts that have all the detailed values for all the different variables, for wind speed, for temperature, for atmospheric pressure, etc. So he just types those values from the midpoint into the computer model and hits play again, and assumes, of course, that it's going to be exactly the same, right? Same numbers, same model, surely it will be the same outcome. But as he looks at the data about 2 weeks into the future, the weather is radically different from the first simulation. And he's totally confused why this is. He assumes he's mistyped or he made a mistake with the numbers, but he checks them and they're all right. And what he eventually comes up with, this revelation that leads to chaos theory, is he realizes that the computer printout stops after 3 decimal points. So if the number is 1.234567889, the computer is printing out 1.234. And what he realizes is that the minutiae, the tiny details of life, and in this model, the tiny details of wind speed, are sufficient to radically reshape a day 2 or 3 weeks into the future from a blue sky day to intense thunderstorms. And this is this notion scientifically that the tiny details of life can change everything. Now, of course, we are subject to the laws of physics as are weather systems, right? So one of the things that I'm arguing is that we're subject to chaos theory too, which is tied to this notion of how everything is intertwined. And this mass murder 119 years ago can lead to this conversation that we're having today. Now, in addition to this, you have this aspect of one of the ideas that I bring in the book repeatedly, and I think it's very hopefully receptive for this audience, is this idea that we have very limited control in the world, right? We're part of an intertwined world of 8 billion interconnected beings in an ever-changing universe and planet. That doesn't really mean that we have no ability to influence things. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a shift of our frame from control to influence. And I think this idea that we control nothing but influence everything is actually a much more empowering and scientifically accurate way to think about our role in the world and our role in humanity. Now, I've talked a little bit about chaos theory. I want to talk about two ideas in evolutionary biology and how they might teach us some lessons about how change operates. And they're the ideas of contingency and convergence. So in shorthand, contingency is sort of the stuff happens theory of evolutionary biology. Every so often, the wrong beetle gets squished and boom, you have a new species. Convergence is the opposite. Convergence is the sort of everything happens for a reason school of evolutionary biology where certain things work and therefore they survive. So there's the sort of disordered chaos of contingency and the ordered patterns of convergence. How can we actually understand this in a less abstract way? Well, if we think about the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, and I will say AI has a little bit of a ways to go because I tried to get it to do the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, and the Earth is somehow the asteroid. But nonetheless, I decided to keep it in because it amused me. But the point is that when you think about that asteroid, the best physics knowledge that we have today is that 66 million years ago, or in the run-up to 66 million years ago, this vast part of distant space called the Oort cloud oscillated. And it oscillated in a way that flung a rock towards the Earth. And it flung the rock towards the Earth where it hit in exactly the worst place from the perspective of the dinosaurs. Because it hit this very gypsum-rich rock off the Yucatan Peninsula in these shallow seas. And so in spite of the fact that the asteroid created these incredible temperatures right away, which did kill lots of things, it was about the same temperature as you broil a chicken in the oven, what really killed the dinosaurs was the toxic gas from this gypsum-rich rock. And so 66 million years ago, you have this contingent moment where basically all living organisms that survive to this day are derived from lineages that could either dig or swim. And everything else pretty much died. Now, the really bewildering thing about this is that if that space rock had hit a few seconds earlier or a few seconds later, it would have hit somewhere else on the planet, or it might have missed the Earth altogether. And that is the origin story of why mammals rose and why dinosaurs died, and we are the beneficiaries of that. So you have this moment 66 million years ago where if this space rock had been delayed by 2 seconds, all of human history is gone. And that is the ultimate contingency, right? This sort of idea that these little tiny things can matter a great deal. Now, convergence, the opposite, is that sometimes things just sort of follow patterns because they work. The proof is in the pudding, as it were. And so my favorite example of this is that if you were to take the eye of an octopus and you were to take the eye of a human and stick them next to each other, which I don't recommend trying at home, but if you were to do this, you would see that it is the same eye, more or less. The structure is astonishingly similar. And this is not because humans and octopuses are closely related, quite the opposite. We diverged about 600 million years ago in our separate evolutionary lineages, but nature solved the same problem twice in exactly the same way. It came up with almost exactly the same eye. And so what I'm suggesting is that the world unfolds in these two different ways that are often contradictory, but sometimes work together. Contingent convergence. Sometimes the asteroid wipes out the dinosaurs. Sometimes it doesn't really matter what happens because in the end, you still end up with the same eye. And we're somewhere between order and chaos in how our lives unfold. So how does this actually make sense for us, right? I've talked to you about dinosaurs. I've talked to you about thought experiments. Well, I've come up with this idea which riffs off of sort of the Sliding Doors film, which you may have seen with Gwyneth Paltrow, but it's more immediate for a lot of people who don't always take trains or take the tube every day. You have what I call the snooze button effect. So let's imagine that tomorrow you wake up, hopefully after a successful party tonight and have a bit of drinks, and you look at the snooze button, and you think to yourself, I'm pretty tired, I'm gonna slap the snooze button. And then your life rewinds by 5 seconds, and now this time you don't. And the question is, how much does your life diverge from that decision, right? Now, my argument, of course, is that everything will be different in some way, maybe subtly, but of course you can never see the alternative. But you will inevitably meet different people, have different conversations, and those things can aggregate over long time periods, right? Now, for people who are skeptical about this idea that the snooze button can redirect your life, I have what I think is relatively ironclad logic. I haven't heard a persuasive argument against it yet, so I'll challenge you to that. But without going into the graphic details of the moment of conception, I will say that the moment of conception is an obviously contingent moment of the ultimate variety. Because if you change it by even a millisecond, a different human being is born. But what you think about if you wind that clock backwards is, let's say it's 6 hours before the moment of conception, and you stop and there's a cup of coffee on the table, and you decide to have a sip of it, or you don't. All of a sudden you have a different child, right? But that's true for the day before. That's true for the coffee the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that, all the way back to the Big Bang. Because everything had to be exactly as it was for that moment of conception to be exactly as it was. Any changes to the last 13.8 billion years, and you have a different kid, right? So this is the ultimate of contingency, where these ripple effects are always, always happening. We're just completely blind to them because, of course, we only see one world. We only see one life. And yet this means, and this is why the third part of the subtitle of the book is not some sort of self-help phrase, it's actually literally scientifically true, why everything we do matters is, I think, a scientific truth. I think there's nothing we do that has no impact on the world, which is, I think, an antidote to a lot of malaise in the modern world, where a lot of people feel replaceable, interchangeable, robots are going to obviously accelerate this, and so on. So why is contingency written out of intellectual history so often? Why do we so often hear everything happens for a reason, or that we should ignore the noise of life and focus on the signal? And of course, I will speak to this from personal experience, by the way. I often talk about politics and so on the BBC or whatever it is. And I will say that when you get interviewed about an event, no one tells you, right? Justin Webb doesn't ring you up and say, don't say this. But it is obvious to you that you cannot say, I don't know, or, well, sometimes the world is extremely complex and there's 8 billion interacting people, so that's why it happened, right? So you have to sort of come up with a very reductive, very sensible A to B story, where if this happened, then that happened, right? Now, one of the reasons intellectually why this has occurred, why these shifts have happened, is because before the scientific revolution, you have all these seemingly random events befalling people, right? Starvation, disease, all sorts of horrible things happening to individuals, and they have no way to make sense of it. So of course they turn to religion, and religion ends up being one of the main ways that people grapple with uncertainty throughout human history. Now, Isaac Newton and the laws of physics and so on come around, and all of a sudden there's this tantalizing equation where you can start to predict things. And you can start to imagine not just that we can predict where this ball will end up or where this arrow will land, but like maybe if we get a better equation, if we improve our equation, we can predict everything, right? Maybe there is underlying order and we just don't have the right equation yet, right? So there's this tantalizing idea of order and structure dominating through some of the precepts of the scientific revolution. Now, of course, in evolutionary biology, this also sometimes dominates, this idea of everything having a purpose and a function and an adaptive aspect to why it emerges. In the 20th century, there's a man named Motu Kimura. He's not very famous outside of biology, but Motu Kimura really changed a lot of this sort of dogma by coming up with something called the neutral theory of molecular evolution. And what he found was that most mutations that happen, that drive change in genomes and species and so on, are neither helpful nor harmful. They are completely neutral. They are accidents. They just happen, right? And this sort of upends some of these ideas of everything happening for a reason, or this grand structure, the pattern that we're always searching for. And Motu Kimura, by the way, is a good illustration of the principle in his own life. Because when he was deciding to enter science, he was worried about being conscripted into the Japanese military. And so in 1944, he enrolled in the University of Kyoto. And if Henry Stimson had vacationed in Osaka instead, Motu Kimura would have been blown up in a blinding flash of atomic light. So you have this aspect where intellectual history, all these things pivoting on these tiny details, changing the way that the world not only unfolds, but also how we make sense of it. The other problem we have, and this is a problem that is universal to us, is that we have brains that have evolved to make sense of the world through stories. And I'm telling you stories, the book's full of stories, it's because it's the only brains we've got. So I have to make use of it. Now, this is a problem because it means that we are allergic to randomness as explanations. We're allergic to arbitrariness as explanations. We are, in the words of Jonathan Gottschall, a storytelling animal evolved in order to make sense of the world through neat and tidy cause and effect relationships because they tend to help us survive. Why do they help us survive? Well, think about this. Imagine that you are in the sort of hunter-gatherer period, which is most of human history, and you see a rustling in the grass, or you hear a rustling in the grass. Now, you have two options. One is you can say, oh my God, this might be a saber-toothed tiger, so I should probably run away. The other is, it's probably just the wind, so I'll just stay put. Now, if it's a false positive, in other words, if it's a situation where you think it might be nothing, and it turns out to be a saber-toothed tiger, you will die, right? Because you're going to get eaten. On the other hand, if you end up thinking that it is a tiger, and you run away, and it turns out to be just the wind, you just waste a few calories, but you survive. So our brains have evolved to over-detect patterns. We're very, very good at it. We're extremely, extremely attuned to pattern detection. Part of the reason why conspiracy theories are incredibly seductive to us, because they make patterns out of seemingly random and often very random actual occurrences. But they also are something where we process this, and I'll show you, I'll just illustrate this right now, with something like the London Blitz. So the London Blitz is this period where, death is raining from the sky. You have no idea where to go or what to do. So what do you turn to? Well, there's a massive surge in superstition in London during the Blitz. Huge amount of documented cases where people are trying to have lucky amulets and so on because they just don't want to get hit by a bomb. So if you look at the details of where the bombs started falling, and you map them in these various quadrants, you can see the sort of bits of London and so on, where would we all go? I suspect all of us would go to the top right, where there's the four bombs, as it were. It's inverted, so I want to make sure you have the top right. So where there's the four bombs that have fallen. That makes a lot of sense, right? Even though we think there's probably some randomness here, like if I was being strategic, I wouldn't go to the quadrant with 31. Except for there's a problem. Because if I now do nothing to the dots, but I draw the quadrants differently, now where do you go? Well, they're exactly the same dots. So what's happened is it's just because our pattern detection machines have all of a sudden processed the data in a different way based on the dotted lines. And so this is the problem where our over-detection of patterns is irrational, but it's what we've got. So we sometimes make mistakes as a result of this. Now this shows up in our fiction, and one of the things that I wish I had used this example in the book, but came to me afterwards. I read murder mysteries sometimes to unwind. And murder mysteries are the ultimate version of this in fiction, right? Because the first 230 pages are a series of seemingly random things. And the last 20 pages, Hercule Poirot or Sherlock Holmes comes out and says, everything makes sense. And actually, the murder mysteries that flop are the ones where there's the loose end. Wait, that one detail didn't make sense. The world is full of loose ends. There are all these arbitrary things that happen, but we demand of our fiction to eliminate that. And we hate watching fiction or listening to fiction or reading fiction where it doesn't end up in this neat and tidy story. And indeed, this is the actual bombs, by the way. It's a completely random spread. They just missed by a random amount. But if you look at this with narrative bias and how we expect this of our fiction, you will see that this also can be a way to make sense of things that are massive cultural phenomena, like Harry Potter, for example, right? So without giving the spoilers away, as it were, we don't know how Harry Potter is going to end when we're reading it or when we're watching it. But what we do know, I think, is that it's not, this is from Jonathan Gottschall, another excellent scholar. He says, what we do know is that Harry Potter isn't going to defeat Voldemort because the latter slips on a banana peel and breaks his head, right? We know that that's not going to be the ending. And that's because it would just absolutely flop the book. I mean, it would destroy the series if that was the big ending, was that it was sort of arbitrary. And of course, my existence is an arbitrary fact. It's an arbitrary feature of all these things, from the dinosaurs getting wiped out by an errant asteroid from the Oort cloud to a mass murder in 1905. But what we demand and what we expect of how we make sense of the world is always order and neat and tidy narratives that make everything make sense. Now, the other problem that we have is that we have, in this moment, something that is totally at odds with how most of human history has unfolded, where we have now the illusion of control over the world, where the neat and tidy narratives seem to make the most sense they ever have. And what I mean by that is that when you think about, again, the hunter-gatherer period, those people were walloped by calamities all the time. They might think there was going to be some food and then there's a famine, or they might go to hunt and there's no animals, or there might be disease that they're ravaged by. All these calamities in the day-to-day life, you might die in childbirth, etc., right? But the superstructure, the overall character of the world didn't change that much for hundreds of thousands of years. If you knew how to hunt and if you knew how to gather, you could teach your children how to do that and they would navigate a similar world to you, right? Generation after generation after generation. Now what we have done is we have completely flipped that dynamic. What we have now is the most extremely ordered and predictable day-to-day lives, probably of any humans ever, where we can know exactly how long, I drove here and I knew exactly how long it was going to take with Google Maps. I can click a button and I know when something from Amazon will arrive. I can have all these sort of things where I can go to Starbucks anywhere in the country and get the same drink. The illusion of control in daily life is paramount to how we exist today. On the other hand, the superstructure of the world is changing extremely rapidly and in terrible and disorienting ways, right? So much so, by the way, that we're one of the first generations of humanity where children teach their parents how to use technology rather than the reverse. That's never happened before. And what I say is that we've designed an upside-down world as a result of this, in which Starbucks never changes, but rivers dry up and democracies collapse. It's exactly the opposite of what we want, right? We want to have serendipity in the daily life and order and control in the superstructure of the world, and yet exactly the opposite has unfolded if you think about the 21st century and the series of calamities that keep happening over and over and over, all while we imagine that we have unprecedented levels of control in our daily life. Now, the question then becomes sort of how do we make sense of this and how do we live? And I'm going to finish talking by a few different ideas. I talk about a bunch of this in the book, but it's something where just a few of these that I'd like to discuss to finish how we might navigate a world that is swayed by the arbitrary, the accidental, the random, and the uncertain. Now, the first bit of advice is one in which this is the two-word advice that my grandfather gave to me when I was a kid about how to have a successful life. And he is the son, by the way, of the man who came home to see his family murdered. So he knows a little bit about the subject, but his advice was to avoid catastrophe. That's his advice. And it sounds silly, right? It's like so obvious. How many of our systems are designed for that? All of our systems are designed for optimization. Short-term, sort of sugar highs. Get the Q3 results through the roof. Win the election, right? Everything is about the short-term optimization. So little is about resilience. And the cost of that is that our systems are really, really brittle. Because if you remember a couple years ago in 2021, there was this one gust of wind that twisted this one boat sideways. It blocked the Suez Canal, and it caused $54 billion of economic damage. That is not possible in a resilient system. It is possible in a hyper-optimized, hyper-efficient system in which there's no slack, and we can't imagine anything going wrong until, of course, it inevitably does. Right? So this is one other idea for how we can think about our own lives, is prioritize resilience over optimization, even as everything we are told about how to be successful is about optimization. The next thing I would say is that in a world that is swayed by these arbitrary, accidental, random forces, where chaos theory reigns supreme, experimentation is the smartest strategy. And yet a lot of us don't do this, right? And I count myself in this. I've tried to do more of this, but I would say that, especially pre-pandemic, I lived a very unexperimental life. And one of the lessons, or it's one of the stories that I think illustrates this point really beautifully about how human creation and human discovery and so on can be swayed by experimentation, is a story that Tim Harford has talked about previously, but it's a story about Keith Jarrett, one of the premier jazz pianists, who went to a concert at the Cologne Opera House, and he was a real sort of control top-down kind of, it has to be exactly as I want it, this piano must be on stage, this exact piano, right? Not something slightly different, but this exact piano has to be on stage. Now, somebody screwed up. Maybe it was an intern, maybe it was concert organizer, whatever it was. But there was no piano, except for the practice piano, which was terribly out of tune, rickety, extremely old, certainly not fit for one of the best jazz pianists in the world. But Keith Jarrett arrives 2 hours before the show, and what do? You either cancel or you just go with it. So he went with it. and he played, and he had to experiment with the instrument, he had to adapt his style, and so on. Now, this was recorded, and the recording of this concert is still to this day the single best-selling jazz album of all time. And so the aspect of experimentation, it offers a parable for us that when you don't understand the world, as I suspect is true of all of us, right, then a forced experimentation or sort of willingly subjecting yourself to experimentation is a very, very wise strategy for navigating that kind of world. The last thing that I want to say is that so much of the world is telling us that uncertainty and this sort of chaos of life is bad, right? Almost every book about smart thinking is how to slay uncertainty, right? How to use your rational mind to make the optimal choice. I think there's something good about uncertainty sometimes. Of course, it's not good when we don't know whether we have cancer or not. But if we had a spreadsheet that told us exactly what was going to happen in our lives with exact probabilities of 34% you meet this spouse, 37% that you go to this university, it would suck all of what makes being human so wonderful out of our existence. And so one of the other aspects of this is to understand that this chaotic existence is one of the most magical and I think uplifting and empowering aspects of the way the world operates. And the reason I say that is because when we think about the butterfly effect, we almost always talk about the weather, right? We think about the butterfly flapping its wings and the hurricane happening. But we are like the butterflies because there is this migration that exists for the monarch butterflies from the highlands of Mexico, from this place called Michoacan. And the relay of their migration is so long that it's intergenerational, right? So what happens is the monarchs start to move, they go part of the journey, and then they die somewhere. And the next generation starts where that monarch has died. So there's this sort of relay through history and through time, intergenerationally, where whatever that butterfly did 5 or 6 or 7 generations ago does affect your life. But you'll never see it. You'll never know about it. And so what I suggest to you, and I think is a much more empowering idea than thinking we can always slay uncertainty and always assert control, is to imagine that we are like those butterflies constantly flapping our wings, and we don't know what's going to happen, but none of it is meaningless. And I think that is a way to accept that you have no cosmic purpose, as I feel like I'm an accident of a mass murder 119 years ago, and yet the most uplifting message imaginable, that literally everything that I do matters in some way. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thanks for that, Brian. It was really fascinating. And I think a very humanist perspective of everything matters because we have this one life and we strive to make the very best of it that we can. And every interaction with each person you have matters. Yes. We were talking earlier about the impact of COVID and the chaos that created, but making you think differently about death and dying.
Yes, I mean, I think this is something where, for me personally, I was writing the book towards the tail end of COVID restrictions and so on, and thinking about mortality a lot. And I mean, it is something that forces you to grapple with what the meaning of life is, And I think, in a sort of more concrete way, contemplating dying makes you focused on what matters in life. But it's also that there's this sort of aspect that I was really embedding in my own thought about how I look at how many systems are designed in modern life to try to tell us to strip out this sort of awe, this sort of mysticism that can exist in a secular world, right? And I think, to me, when I grapple with that idea about how, I don't think those kids died because there was some divine hand to murder them that then was going to lead to me. I think I am an accident. And I don't think that's bad. I think that we're all accidents. But I think that the world is still extremely, extremely good at showing us why that matters, and it's in us, right? And I think one of the other, it's sort of after you write a book and you start talking about it, sometimes little turns of phrase come to you and you wish you had them earlier. But I think that so much of the world is telling us that what matters in life is stuff and status. And I think everything that matters is people and passion. And I think that those are the sort of drivers where COVID was the wake-up call in a way where I look at a Google Calendar that was full of things that were not as much tied to stuff. I wasn't super motivated by money, but I was more motivated by, career and so on. And just that revelation of thinking, I'm not going to exist in a certain number of years. I would rather enjoy it and try to have ripple effects from my life that make other people's lives better too. And that's where the most fulfilling thing about writing this book is the people who say it's made them think differently about their role in the universe in some way. So that's, it's where you can have a silver lining from a terrible pandemic, perhaps.
Okay. So do we have any questions from the floor?
This is a challenge. In the middle of your really exciting and interesting and convincing talk, precisely 23 minutes to 5, I scratched my head. Now, suppose I had still scratched it, but at 22 minutes to 5,
yep.
What the hell difference would that make to anything?
Yeah,
Thank you.
So I love this question because when I was writing this, I was talking to some friends of mine, and they said, well, what if I raise my hand? Not right now, have I changed the universe? I said, yes. Now, we'll never know, right? But your brain is effectively a meat computer neural network where everything is constantly being updated by everything. I mean, there's nothing that is not an input to your brain in your experience. So it is slightly changing your experience of life, and you don't know whether that will affect you or not. But obviously, something that is quite profound affects you and changes your brain. So why would it be that all this other stuff is just noise that we can write out, right? Now, the other point that I think is underlying the premise of your question, which is one that I often get asked, is, well, if the bomb had been dropped on, Kokura or Kyoto instead, wouldn't the United States still have won the war, right? Like all this stuff, it would just sort of end up like the octopus eyes and the human eyes. It just all sort of washes out in the end. And I always find that it's a function of how our brains process reality, because we categorize things as either important or unimportant, wars being won or lost, but reality is not a binary variable, right? Reality is a continuous variable. In other words, everything is constantly affecting everything else. So if the bomb gets dropped on Kyoto instead, maybe Motu Komura dies, maybe evolutionary biology is slightly different, but also, just Japan will be different if 100,000 different people are dead, right? Now, we have categories by which we make sense of the world. And one of the ones that I like to use is this idea of weeds, right? So like we want to pull weeds out from the ground. What is a weed? A weed is a fast-growing plant that humans don't like, right? There's no actual thing that is a weed. And so our linguistic conventions, our sort of way of experiencing the world, our brains tell us some things don't matter. And I think it's at odds with what chaos theory is telling us about how the way the world works, because of course, things that happened that were tiny, minute details of the world 10 million years ago have affected the way that humans have evolved today. So, I can't tell you how your head scratching has changed the world. And one of the bewildering things, by the way, is that you don't know whether it's good or bad, right? I'm the byproduct of a mass murder, which I find good. But of course, I could plant a tree tomorrow, and in 100 years, a child could fall out of it and die. That would be bad. And so you never really know the moral character of these things, but the intertwined nature of everything, I think, provides a really uplifting aspect to grief and sadness, which is that all of the best moments of our life are inextricably linked to the worst ones, because the two couldn't exist without each other. And that's where I believe that you scratching your head has actually changed your life in some way.
Okay, thank you. When you use the example of the human eye and the octopus eye, it does give me flashbacks to Year 10 RE and St. Aquinas using the eye for intelligent design, but it's nice to see that it's about nature solving a problem in two separate ways. So,
well, I will say so this idea of sort of intelligent design is quite funny, because there's this basically, okay, so crabs and crab-like things have evolved 5 different times on totally separate lineages. So there's some things that we call crabs that are not actually crabs and so on. And there's a term for this called carcinization, where something becomes crab-like. And so there's this joke among evolutionary biologists that if there is a God, he really likes crabs, right? And he will want us to eventually have pincers and be scuttling about and so on. My favorite one of these, the arbitrariness of it, is this animal called the binturong, which exists in Southeast Asia, and it's a really cute animal. But for whatever reason, and I don't think there is a reason, its urine, its pee, produces a chemical that is literally identical, not similar, but identical to the chemical that gives cinema popcorn its aroma. And so if you walk through the jungle where the binturong lives, it smells like a cinema. And, is that the divine hand? I would think it's a rather bizarre choice. I did actually have I was on, I engage with a really wide audience in talking about these ideas, and so I went on to Christianity Today podcast and talked about them. And what was really interesting was that there's this fluke that I discussed, which I think is, really, really bizarre, where the sort of, the current research suggests that the origin story of placenta, and therefore mammals and so on, came from a shrew-like creature 100 million years ago being infected by a retrovirus, okay? And this is where a placenta comes from. Now, I said to him, I was like, I guess God could have done that, but surely there would have been a more direct way, right? You wouldn't need to get the shrew involved if you actually had omniscient powers, but it's sort of one of those things where, you make it as you will.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions right at the back down there, I think.
Thank you for a very entertaining talk. Would it be true to say you're a non-compatible determinist?
Yes. So this is where I sometimes lose people. I am a hard determinist. Yes. So I don't believe in free will, and this is one of those things where I think this debate often gets muddled by definitions. I don't think there's a difference between my mind and my brain. And I can't control my brain, so why could I be able to control my mind? I can't control cell division, so why thoughts would be any different? I mean, it does create a very bewildering idea, which I believe, but I believe that everything in my life was determined by the Big Bang or whatever the origin of the universe is. But I think there's a lot of pretty compelling logical argumentation around this. I also am, aware that the limits of our understanding, I mean, one of my friends who's a top evolutionary biologist, he said, will we ever understand these huge questions about consciousness or free will when what we have to compute them are brains that have evolved for bipedal apes to live long enough to reproduce, right? And I don't know. So what I try to say in the book is I say, look, here's how I solve the puzzle of free will. I don't believe it exists. I don't believe libertarian free will makes sense in all of the precepts of science. Or put differently, that if libertarian free will was correct, then many, many things that are bedrock principles of science would have to be wrong. But I also think it's worth having some intellectual humility that science is regularly disproven in certain ways, not because the scientific premise or discipline is not worthwhile, but because we learn things and we update our beliefs. And so, I have my suppositions, but I think these questions will continue to be debated for some time. I suspect the 21st century will be transformative in this because I think this will be the century of neuroscience in many ways.
Okay, and we have one question over here.
Would you say a little bit more about resilience versus optimization in regards to kind of the individual self, how I could more successfully lead my own life?
Yes. So I'm gonna expand your question slightly, and I'll talk about society as well as the individual. So one of the examples with society, before I come to your question, is it's not that efficiency is bad, it's not that optimization is bad, it's that if a system is uncertain, over-optimizing is very dangerous. So an example of this was there was a Latin American country that was putting in a new power grid. And they had two options. One was to make a national power grid that was cheaper and more efficient, and the other was to make a regional power grid which had hubs and nodes, more inefficient, more expensive. The first blackout, it paid for itself. They went for it, right? They went for the more expensive, less efficient option because it was compartmentalizing the risk, right? It meant that when there was inevitably something that went wrong, they could shut down the area where it had gone wrong and everything else still worked. So it was a very, very good bet, even though in the short term, it was not good for shareholders, not good for investors, et cetera. And I think that principle applies to our lives, is thinking about when things go wrong, what do you still have? What are the things that you think are resilient? And I think, on the less side of resilience are things like, your career unfolding exactly as you want it to go. What is more resilient is people you love and things you love doing, things you're passionate about, right? And COVID, in a way, I think was something that forced us to think about what is resilient. A lot of the things about our lives, including, by the way, loved ones, I accept, were taken away from us from this period, but it also made us think, what can we still have? And for me personally, at least, this is where I thought that, some of the meaning of life can be intrinsic. It can be, the universe understanding itself through humanity and trying to sort of make sense of the world, learn about our world interact with other people, make the world better. These things are resilient. They are not something that can be eliminated as long as humans still exist. And so, I think when you mostly look at self-help books or life hacks, I hate life hacks, because what they're trying to tell you is your life is a failure until you get that 3% of inefficiency stamped out of it, right? If you only get to inbox 0, then you'll be fine. It's exactly the opposite message that makes sense because it is the least resilient, right? The most resilient things are the things that are slower, they're less difficult to destroy, and they will survive calamities intact.
Thank you. One more question. I'm determined we're going to finish on time. So right in the middle in the yellow shirt, if you can wait for a microphone to come to you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting talking the book itself, basically based on current understanding of the world is more sarcastic, probabilistic. Many other authors have discussed the same thing, and all around what to make the best of that. Black Swan, the book will argue, you have overall the book itself about speculation of financial markets, so it has utility. It says focus on black swan events. It's a bit like avoid catastrophe, but flip side. Other book, for example, Thinking Fast and Slow, says it's all about making the best decision every single step, and statistically, that you are heading towards the best direction. But if we have this deterministic view inside that says, okay, our actions really is not that much of free will, then they just happens. And there's no inherent good or bad to action, then in your view, the best way to achieve whatever we want to achieve without overall utility isn't just a mindset adjustment instead of action adjustment.
Yeah, so, I think one of the things that's worth thinking about is that a lot of these books that are about, like Thinking Fast and Slow is a brilliant book about cognitive biases and so on. And the Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb is a very important book about how and why shocks happen in the world. And I interact with them in sort of two ways. One is that I think we have to acknowledge that there are some spaces, a significant amount of spaces, in fact, that are of what Mervyn King calls radical uncertainty, which is where there is literally no data and no information and no decision-making model that can help you navigate this. So, the example they give in the book, in their book, is President Obama deciding whether or not to greenlight the operation that kills Osama bin Laden. They don't know whether he's there. They've never done a raid into Pakistan. There's no way to forecast. There's no information. They can all have guesses, but they don't even know if the person they're trying to assassinate is there. So how can you possibly make an informed decision in that, right? And what I use as an example instead is I say, okay, let me ask you a question. What is the world going to look like in 2050? It's an impossible question to answer. It doesn't matter what our models or our supercomputers will tell us. We have no idea, because tiny events can have big consequences. So what I think is where we get into trouble is that as our tools improve, we end up producing more and more senses of certainty in a less and less certain world. And this is a problem particularly with things like AI and machine learning, because what they do is they learn patterns from the past at a time where the future is changing faster than it has ever before in history, right? So, this is a problem economists call non-stationarity, which is basically while you're measuring something, the cause and effect dynamics are actually shifting as you're measuring it. And so I think this is something where, this illusion of control idea is something that's particularly dangerous, right? If you think that you have solved the problem, if you think that the world is stable and ordered and structured, and your tools to do that are getting better and better and better, you are setting yourself up for catastrophe instead. And so it's a certain mentality shift. There's not a silver bullet to this. I can't eliminate uncertainty. It's a mentality shift where I think we need to demand of our politicians and of our business leaders that maybe it's a better idea to not optimize to the absolute limit where you embed risk, catastrophic risk into the system, but instead we start to reward people for long-term planning. And the problem is, of course, that human nature doesn't do this, right? If you were to be a government that invests in preparedness and long-term risk aversion, and it costs money now, but it solves a problem later, you get hammered at the polls, right? Democracy has embedded some short-term thinking into this. Same with CEOs who, lower the profits in this quarter in order to plan for 10 years down the road. So we have to have a sort of debate, I think, as a society about how these trade-offs exist and how we need to amplify this message that the world is much more chaotic and uncertain than we pretend it to be, than our brains imagine it to be. And therefore, we need to find ways to reward people in positions of authority who design systems that are far more resilient so that when the black swans come, they're less damaging and less harmful to a larger swath of humanity. And of course, climate change is one of the biggest ones of those of all. So yes, thank you very much.